It starts with a sound, not a bang, nor a whisper, but the shiver of ice in a glass, that rattling lullaby that once heralded his presence, then mine. When people ask how monsters are made, they expect stories of trauma, of breaking and bleeding, of some original wound. But my story is more treacherous. It's not about being broken. It's about how I learnt to love the fracture lines, how I ran my fingers along them like an addict tracing veins, injecting history right back into the bloodstream. My father was a drinker. No, that's too soft. He was a devourer of spirits, a man who drank not to forget, but to make others remember their place, their powerlessness, their fear. He was not the tragic drunk slumped in alleys or sleeping through dawn. He was the kind who came alive when the whiskey hit, when the room thickened with silence and the air smelled of tension and regret. His drinking wasn't disease, it was theatre, and I was front row. He called it the medicine, as though rage were a sickness he cured with fire, and he burned through our home with steady cruelty, like a man gardening with gasoline. There was never a need to yell. His voice was cold, soft, like a blade pressed to your neck. You'd stop breathing before he ever raised it. And I hated him in the way a child learns to hate too early. Not with rebellion, but mimicry. I studied him like scripture. I mapped his cruelties with the reverence of a disciple and stored them away like heirlooms. When I was 12, I made a vow in the quiet of a bruised night. One day I will make you small, not gone, not dead, just small, diminished, contained. At his funeral, people said he was a hard man, but he loved his boy. They said it the way one might talk about a dog that bites only strangers, as if domesticated violence deserved applause. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I'd already mourned him 100 times before that day, in every slammed door and shattered glass, in every room I entered and instinctively scanned for exits. I should have walked away after he died. I should have taken the closure, whatever that meant, and planted it like a flag in the field of moving on. But revenge isn't just about settling scores. Sometimes it's about tasting the power you were denied, letting it bloom like rot inside you. So I drank. Not immediately. It started slow, a drink on his birthday, a toast on the anniversary of his death. Nostalgic sips at first, ceremonial, almost poetic, but the glass became a mirror, and soon I wasn't toasting, I was invoking. You don't become your father in one night. You inherit him, like a cancer waiting to metastasize. The whiskey became my confessional. Each pour was a prayer, each gulp an offering. Not to God, I'd long stopped believing in redemption, but to the version of me I thought I could control, the better man, the one who drank for peace, not power. But even better men have shadows. My wife saw it first. The way I'd stare through her during arguments, the cold, methodical silence. I never hit. That's what I told myself, as if violence needed to be physical to be real, as if words, sharp and strategic, couldn't carve the same scars. She left before I could finish turning, before I could gift her the full performance. I blamed her, of course, for leaving, for not understanding. But deep down, I was proud. I had learned from the best. My father didn't lose people because he was cruel. He lost them because he was unforgettable in his cruelty. When I first revisited his old house, I told myself it was closure. The place had been left to rot, just like he had. Mice in the walls, dust on the memories. I stood in the kitchen, the same one where I'd once hidden under the table, and I poured a drink from the half-empty bottle still sitting there. The same brand he used to call truth serum. I sat in his chair. I lit one of his old cigarettes, even though I'd never smoked before, and I whispered to the air, "Do you see? I became more than you. I became the architect." That night, I dreamed he was still alive, not screaming, not drinking, just watching me from across the room, not judging, smiling, as if I'd finally arrived. You see, monsters don't die. They multiply, they mutate, they migrate from father to son, from memory to muscle, and I carried him, in my gestures, in my inflections, in the way I tightened my jaw when someone spoke too loud. I didn't need his voice in my ear, I had it in my bones. People say forgiveness is the only way to heal, but they never talk about what happens when healing isn't the goal, when the wound becomes your identity. I made him my monster, but not to fight him, to wear him, to feel, for once, what it was like to be the one feared. But how long can you wear a mask before it becomes your face? How long before the echo in the glass stops sounding like him and starts sounding like home? Grief has a peculiar sound when it is laced with satisfaction. It's not a sob, it's a sigh, long, low, and almost grateful. That's how I felt the morning I heard he'd died alone in the rust-tinged bed of a forgotten veterans' hospice. No one had held his hand. No priest was called. His last breath was heard only by the buzzing of a faulty fluorescent light. The man who once shook rooms with his presence had vanished like steam in an open window. No bang, just silence. An old man, skin paper thin, veins blooming like bruises, reduced to a footnote in the shift nurse's report. And I, his son, his heir in cruelty. I was the one who orchestrated it. Not in the sense of poisoning or smothering. That would have been too merciful, too cinematic. No, I did it the slow way, the quiet way. I dismantled him with absence. See, he needed someone to hate to survive. Rage was his oxygen, and I suffocated him by withdrawing every possible provocation. I stopped returning calls. I moved and never gave him my address. When his letters came, slurred and apologetic, "Son, I'm trying," they said. "This time I really am." I fed them to the fire without reading past the first line. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew they were written in whiskey, not ink. And when his doctor finally reached me, said my father was on a steep decline, liver gone, bones brittle, eyes going foggy, I told them I was not in contact, a phrase so simple, so bureaucratic. It almost sounded mature, but it wasn't maturity. It was vengeance dressed in the robes of boundary setting. He withered, not from disease alone, but from starvation of what kept him alive, me. I became his hunger. I became the last face he wanted to see, and the one I denied him with surgical cruelty. I let him die, wondering if I still flinched at the sound of ice clinking in a glass. Let him rot, asking himself if I had become a better man than he was. The answer, that I'd become a darker, quieter version, would have either killed him sooner or thrilled him. The day I identified the body, I didn't flinch. The morgue was cold, but I felt nothing. He looked small, not in the way I had imagined, not shattered, not weak, but ordinary, human. The monster I'd built in my mind all my life had shrunk to fit into a drawer. It should have felt triumphant. It should have marked the end of something. Instead, I walked out into the grey afternoon with an ache I couldn't name, a dull hum in the chest. Not guilt, not yet, but a kind of echo, the feeling of having prepared a lifetime for a battle and then realizing the war had ended long ago. I thought that would be the worst of it, but grief, real grief, wears different clothes when it arrives late. It didn't hit me in the funeral home or at the scattering of ashes, which only 2 strangers and a rain cloud attended. No, it came weeks later, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, while cleaning out his house. The same sagging structure that had echoed with his temper, the kitchen that smelled of burnt apologies, the hallway where I once swore I'd never return. I found a box beneath the floorboards of his room, old letters unsent, pictures of me, aging through every school year, a Father's Day card I vaguely remembered giving him, sticky with glue and misspelled words. He'd kept them all, stored them like sacred relics beneath the rot of the floor, hidden even from himself. That's when the first crack appeared. Not in my voice, not in my composure, but in my certainty. What if his love, twisted though it was, had been real? What if his apologies, soaked in bourbon and broken syntax, weren't lies but cries from a man too sick to stop himself? And more dangerous still, what if I'd become worse than him? He lashed out because he was drowning. I let him drown because I wanted to watch him sink. Cruelty, when practiced long enough, becomes indistinguishable from control. I thought I was reclaiming power, but what if I had only refined his tools? What if vengeance, so slow and elegant in my hands, had become more monstrous than his outbursts ever were? My ex-wife called once, months after his death. She heard I'd been drinking again, said she hoped I was okay. I laughed. Define okay. She said something then that stuck. You're not your father, David, but you're not. A riddle in a wound. It sat in me like a splinter I refused to pull out. Some nights now, I talk to him, out loud. Usually when I've had a few, when the ice hums and the room feels just dim enough to house ghosts. I tell him stories. Not fond ones. Just fragments. Like how I yell at the mirror sometimes and don't know why. Or how I once poured a drink just to stare at it until it warmed to room temperature. Or how I sometimes smell whiskey and feel safe. And in those moments, I wonder, did he do the same? Did he sit in that creaking chair after I left and ask the dark if he'd broken something beyond repair? Did he ever feel it, that low, persistent ache of becoming your worst moment? I made him my monster. And then I became him. Quieter, colder, more articulate, in my harm. Some nights I even drink to that. Not to forget, but to remember exactly how it felt to be on both ends of the glass. The strange thing about violence is that it echoes, not in volume, but in timing. It arrives late, in habits, in voices raised too quickly, in the moment you flinch at nothing at all. After his death, After the cold house and the warm whiskey and the endless conversations with ghosts, I tried silence. Not sobriety, that's too noble a term for what I attempted. I simply tried to stop making noise. I spoke less. I answered calls with grunts. I left the television off and let the rooms breathe. But silence isn't peace when you've lived your life braced for sound. It becomes a performance, a vigil for what you fear will return. I inherited more from him than I admitted at first. Not just the temper, not just the taste for ritualized drinking, but the stillness that comes after the storm, the false calm, the quiet before you ruin something. I started noticing it in my posture, in how I stood with my arms crossed, even when I wasn't cold, in the way I stared at people longer than necessary, not with intent, but with calculation. I had become fluent in his brand of quiet intimidation. I never threatened. I just waited, let others fill the air with their nervous explanations. My presence alone became enough to make others uneasy. That's what he had done. That's what I had become. I dated a woman named Lena not long after. She was soft-spoken, with the kind of eyes that searched you when she listened, not judging, just cataloguing. We met at a bookstore. She asked what I was reading. I lied and said poetry when it was really just a memoir about war. For a time, I was gentle with her. Not out of affection, but fear. Fear that if I loved her too much, I'd turn her into something breakable. She was light, not naive, but unscarred, and I didn't want to be the one who wrote the first crack. But it came anyway. Not with a slap, not with a scream, just with the slow retreat. The days I didn't call, the way I'd drink before seeing her, just enough to dull the sharp edges of feeling. She noticed. Of course she did. One night, she asked if I was angry. No, I said, I'm just tired. She looked at me and said, you carry something too heavy to be tired from work. That was the night I knew I'd lose her, because she had seen it, not the ghost of my father, but the ghost I had become. Not cruel, not violent, just distant in a way that eroded everything soft. We ended quietly, a coffee shop goodbye, no tears, just the slow recognition that not every wound bleeds. After her, I didn't try again, not because I couldn't love, but because I knew I'd built my heart like his, behind walls so high, even the echo of kindness couldn't reach. I visited his grave once, not out of guilt, but curiosity. It was modest, a flat plaque, nearly swallowed by weeds. I stood there and wondered if bones remember, if his skull, now resting in dirt, still carried the echo of my name. I said nothing, no apologies, no accusations, just silence. The same silence he had gifted me on so many nights when I cried quietly in bed, hoping he would open the door and say something, anything that resembled love. But silence was always his language, and now it was mine. I think about legacy often, not in the grand sense of inheritance or bloodlines, but in the minute ways we pass ourselves on, in how my jaw clenches before I speak, in how I stare at unfinished drinks with something like reverence, in how I remember pain more vividly than joy. That's the inheritance he left me, not money, not memories worth framing, just the art of withering slowly, so quietly that even those closest don't notice until the bloom is gone. Sometimes I wonder what he would have been if he had been loved differently, or if I had. But those are dangerous questions, the kind that lead nowhere good, the kind that let the monster back in. I tell myself I'm different, but then I feel it, the weight of my own silence, and I realize I've just become better at hiding the raw. There is a particular clarity that comes not from sobriety, but from being drunk just slowly enough, a place between coherence and haze, where your thoughts turn liquid and truths rise to the surface like oil on water. It was there in that place that I first admitted it to myself. I didn't hate my father. I envied him, not his life, not his choices, but his certainty. He drank like it meant something, like every pour was part of a liturgy only he could perform. He was cruel, yes, but not aimless. There was method in his madness, rhythm in his descent. And I had inherited the thirst, but none of the conviction. I was chaos in slow motion. I drank not to forget, nor to feel. I drank to be inhabited, to let something older, sharper, crueler move through me. It wasn't possession, it was permission. I gave myself over, willingly, to the echo of a man I swore I'd never become. And still, I kept a mirror in the kitchen. Not to check my hair, not to watch myself drink, but to witness the transformation, to see the moment my face stopped being mine and started being his. It was never dramatic, no twisted smirk, no flash of recognition, just a subtle shift, the eyes a little harder, the mouth a little meaner, the jaw set with something ancient. I studied that face the way a child studies his father's shoes. Reverently, fearfully, hoping one day to grow into them, and dreading it all the same. I remember one night, deep winter, wind clawing at the windows, snow like ash. I poured a drink and whispered his name into the glass. Not Dad. Not Father. Just the name I never dared say as a boy. The name that lived on bills and prescriptions and, later, his death certificate. I said it aloud, softly, like invoking a spirit. Edwin. And then I drank him. That's how it felt, like I was letting him pass through me again, one sip at a time. People don't understand how addiction works when it's built on memory. They think it's about escape. But some of us drink not to leave something behind, but to step back into it, to re-enter the fire because it's the only warmth we've ever known. I wasn't running from pain. I was curating it. I chose it with care, aged it like wine, polished its edges until it gleamed. That's how I became him, not through accident, but architecture. And here's the worst part. I liked it. There was a moment, a few months after Lena left, when I met her in a grocery store. Her hair was longer. She looked rested. I, on the other hand, looked like I'd crawled out of someone else's shadow. We spoke politely, banally. Weather, mutual friends, books. And then she looked me straight in the face and said, "You know what scared me most, David?" I braced myself. "It wasn't your anger. It was how comfortable you seemed inside it." That's when it hit me. I hadn't just repeated the cycle. I had refined it. My father's rage was raw, a blunt instrument. Mine was artful, precise. I could hurt with silence. I could ruin with a glance. I wore my cruelty like a tailored suit, never wrinkled, never stained. But beneath it, I was rotting. I started dreaming of mirrors, endless mirrors, stretching into darkness. In each I was slightly different, older, younger, drinking, crying, laughing, but always alone, and always, somewhere in the background, him, watching, smiling, as if to say, "You've finally understood." The dreams turned to nightmares, not of violence, but of memory. The first time he hit me, not hard, just enough to teach, was over a spilled drink. I was 6. I'd knocked over his glass while reaching for the remote. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He just leaned down, eyes level with mine, and said, "There are things men don't do, son, and ruining another man's peace is one of them." Then he slapped me, open palm, quick, like punctuation. I carried that sentence with me all my life, and now I used it. On lovers, on friends, on myself. Every time I cut someone off, every time I vanished instead of explaining, every time I chose silence over apology, I told myself I was protecting my peace. But what I was really doing was preserving his, because somewhere deep down, I still believed his version of manhood was the only one that mattered. I drank not because I wanted to forget him. I drank because I feared that without the liquor, without the bitterness, without the cruelty, there would be nothing of him left in me. And that terrified me more than anything, because then I'd have to face what remained. Me. My father's greatest lie wasn't in what he said. He didn't speak much, but in how he lived. The illusion he crafted, over years of ritual and drink, was this: that power was protection, that if you made others afraid enough, you could never be hurt again. It worked, for a time. He was feared. In bars, in our home, even in his silences, he commanded space. But when the end came, not swift but staggered, the illusion dissolved. Power didn't shield him, it isolated him. And now, years later, I stood in the ruins of that inheritance. I wasn't surrounded by mourners, no children, no partner, no friends who knew the full weight of my history, just echoes, just the dull rhythmic pulse of memory knocking against the walls of an apartment I hadn't cleaned in weeks. They say you can only break a cycle by naming it. But what if the name is yours? One night, I walked to the old bar he used to haunt. The sign had changed, the stools were new, but the smell, beer, bleach, loneliness was the same. I sat in the far corner, where he used to sit, ordered his drink, neat, no ice, no apologies. I stared into the glass, waiting for it to speak. It did, not in words, but in sensation. A warm, familiar sorrow, the kind you don't cry from, the kind you marry. I watched the other patrons, a man hunched over his third pint, 2 women laughing too loudly at a booth, a bartender checking her phone between orders. They were strangers, but in that moment they felt like reflections of paths not taken, lives I could have touched, broken, maybe even healed, if I hadn't been so committed to the performance of pain. That's what no one tells you about vengeance. It's addictive, not because it satisfies, but because it gives structure to grief. A reason, a direction, something to do with your hands while your soul starves. I had fed myself on that structure, built an entire identity out of shadowboxing a ghost, and now the ghost was gone. The anger, stale, the rituals, empty. What was left? One night, in a moment of reckless honesty, I pulled out a notebook, not a journal. I still hated that word, but paper, ink, something tangible. I began to write, not to him, to myself. It started as a list. Every time I remembered hurting someone and walked away justified. Every time I used his voice and called it instinct. Every time I left before being left. The list grew, pages turned, and then I found myself writing something I hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not self-pity, not regret dressed in poetry, just the cold, unadorned truth of having chosen cruelty when kindness was possible. There was a moment when I paused, looked at the words. My hand shook slightly. The drink beside me remained untouched. It was the first time I realized I didn't want to be him anymore. Not because I'd outgrown him, but because I'd finally buried him. He had lived inside me for so long, not as a man, but a compass. Every decision, every relationship, every silence calibrated to his memory. Now that compass spun aimlessly. I didn't know who I was without him. But I wanted to find out, so I stopped drinking. Not in the dramatic 12-step testimonial sense. Just one day, I didn't reach for the bottle. Then the next, then the next. I poured the whiskey down the drain, watched it swirl like history going nowhere. I started seeing a therapist. Her office smelled like tea and cedar. She didn't ask about my father right away. She asked about my dreams. I told her about the mirrors. She said, maybe it's not him watching you. Maybe it's you watching yourself become free. It sounded like nonsense, but it stayed with me. I began walking at night, not to escape, but to remember how it felt to move without purpose, without rage. Sometimes I still hear his voice, not as a haunting, but as a warning when I'm angry, when someone disappoints me, when silence feels safer than truth. I hear him, and I choose differently, not always, but sometimes, and those moments, they're enough. I've started writing letters, not to send, just to practice telling the truth. One of them ends like this. You didn't destroy me, Dad, but you made sure I'd never be whole. I don't forgive you, but I no longer need to carry you. You can rest now. And maybe, finally, so can I. I don't know if healing is real, or if it's just the name we give to surviving long enough that the pain becomes tolerable. But I do know this. The monster I became to kill him, he's dying too. And in the quiet that follows, I am beginning slowly, clumsily, to make something new. Not a legacy, not a name, just a life. There is no neat ending to a story like this. No redemption arc sweeping in to rescue the broken man. No dramatic apology under pouring rain. No final drink poured out as a symbol of rebirth. Just the slow, unremarkable rhythm of choosing to be a little less like him each day. And sometimes failing. Sometimes failing so gently that it almost feels like progress. It's been over a year since I last touched a drink. Not out of discipline, but weariness. Sobriety didn't come to me like a conversion. It came like exhaustion. I was simply too tired of waking up as a version of myself I didn't recognize, or worse, one I recognized all too well. In the stillness that followed, I realized how much space he had taken up. Not just in memory, but in my body, my gait, my voice, even the way I held eye contact, all remnants, ghost gestures, his bones buried under my skin. And now, I am peeling him out of me, layer by layer. Some days, it feels like desecration. Other days, like liberation. There are mornings when I sit by the window and watch the light move across the floor and think, this is it. This is the life he never had. One ungoverned by rage, unlit by liquor, unmarked by cruelty. It's quiet. And sometimes the quiet hurts, because in silence, memories sharpen. I remember the way he breathed before an outburst, the slight pause, the inhale that meant the room was about to change. I remember the look in his eyes when I finally raised my voice at him, the last time we spoke. Not fear, not anger, but something like pride. He saw the mirror then, the reflection he had polished for years, staring back with clenched fists and broken compassion. And he smiled. Not with joy, but with recognition. As if to say, I knew you'd come home. It took me years to understand that vengeance is a kind of grief. That when I said I wanted to make him small, what I really meant was, I want to make my pain smaller. But pain doesn't shrink through cruelty. It expands, finds new homes, new names. I carried him through every failed relationship, every job I left too soon, every night I chose numbness over connection. I wasn't haunted, I was inhabited. But now I live alone. Not just in apartment, but in self. And it is lonely. Freedom always is, at first. There's no enemy left to fight, no father to outdo, no monster to aim your anger at. Just you, sitting in the silence, asking what kind of man you want to be when no one's watching. I think of children sometimes. Not mine, I never had any. But I imagine what I might have passed on, the ways I might have taught cruelty without ever raising a hand, the sharpness of my words, the weight of my silences, the echo of my father, reverberating down another generation. And I feel both relief and sorrow. Relief that I didn't continue the line. Sorrow that I never got to rewrite it. There's a photo on my desk now. It's the only one I kept. Me, at 7, sitting on his lap. We're both looking away from the camera. I'm not smiling, neither is he. But our hands are touching, lightly, barely. That's the part I can't look away from. The almost, the maybe. The proof that once, just once, we were both unsure enough to reach. He was a monster. But not only, and I became him. But not entirely. That's the truth I live with now. Not the clean myth of evil passed down like a curse, but the murky, painful truth of inheritance and choice, of trauma and mimicry, of love warped by fear. Some nights, I still hear the clink of ice in a glass. But now I let it pass. I light a candle instead. Not for him, not for me, for the space between us. The place where we almost touched, where something better might have lived. And I ask myself quietly, what if monsters aren't born or made, but remembered? And if we choose to forget them, not erase but release, who do we become? Who do we become when the echo finally fades?